Imagine walking into an old, abandoned opera house, only to find chains rattling in the dark and 17 bodies waiting for you. Now imagine this. Every single one of those people had already been declared dead. Their names written on death certificates months, even years, earlier. What kind of monster could pull that off? Tonight, we're uncovering the terrifying truth behind one of America's most disturbing forgotten crimes. In the fall of 1891, in the small industrial town of Millerville, Pennsylvania, authorities stumbled on something so horrifying. They buried it under lock and key. 17 people, yes, 17, were discovered chained in the basement of the abandoned Millerville Opera House. Their bodies showed signs of long captivity and unspeakable abuse. But here's the detail that froze investigators in their tracks. Every single one of them was already supposed to be dead. Their death certificates had been filed months, even years, earlier in 3 different counties. The man behind this nightmare? A charismatic showman named Cornelius Veneer. On the surface, he ran a traveling circus, complete with acrobats, animal acts, and a freak show. But behind the curtain was one of the darkest exploitation schemes in American history. The local paper was gagged. Witnesses were silenced. Corrupt officials lined their pockets and turned away. For years, no one dared to speak about the horrors hidden in plain sight. But tonight, we are. Before we dive deeper into Cornelius Veneer's Cabinet of Wonders, I've got one question for you. Do stories like this fascinate you as much as they do me? If they do, hit subscribe and tap that bell so you never miss one of our investigations into America's darkest mysteries. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Now, back to Millerville. The discovery didn't come from sharp police work. It came from one terrified soul who found the courage to act. Millerville in 1891 was a place in transition. The rolling farmlands and tight-knit German communities were being swallowed up by mines, railroads, and the smokestacks of industry. 8,000 people lived there, many of them recent immigrants chasing the promise of steady work in the mines and foundries. It was a town where nobody asked too many questions, and that silence gave Cornelius Veneer everything he needed to thrive. Tall, well-dressed, confident. He claimed to come from a wealthy Dutch family, though no one ever bothered to check. What mattered was that he flashed real money in the taverns and shops. In 1887, he bought the old opera house, supposedly to house his circus during the winter. From the outside, Veneer's Cabinet of Wonders looked like any other traveling show. People lined up for the acrobats, the animal tricks, and of course, the so-called human curiosities. There was Eliza, the bone serpent woman, whose body twisted in ways that seemed impossible. There was Johann, the Bavarian giant, nearly 8 feet tall and strong enough to bend iron with his bare hands. And there was Mary Catherine, the singing angel, a girl with a voice that could stop your heart, and sleeves that always seemed to hide what lay beneath her missing arms. The crowd saw wonder, but what they didn't see was the truth. Many of these performers hadn't signed up willingly. They'd been taken, selected carefully, people with disabilities, orphans, immigrants with no family nearby, the kind of souls who could vanish without raising alarm. Veneer wasn't alone. He had help. The town sheriff, Josiah Cromwell, was bought off early with monthly payments, more than most men made in 2 months. And Dr. Heinrich Kellerman, who claimed to be a physician from Germany, acted as Veneer's partner. But Kellerman wasn't a real doctor. He was a chemist. His specialty? Drugs strong enough to keep human beings docile for months on end. Their method was as sinister as it was effective. Kellerman would pose as a doctor, offering free exams to the vulnerable. Once he had them alone, he'd use a mix of laudanum and opiates to knock them out cold. When they woke up, they were miles away, chained in the opera house basement, their lives erased. And what came next was even worse. It wasn't just kidnapping. It was a complete dismantling of human identity. Through drugs, manipulation, and sheer brutality, they turned men and women into performers who believed they had no past and no future, only the stage. For years it worked, until October 12, 1891, when the first crack appeared. A young woman staggered into the office of the Millerville Weekly Gazette. She was barely conscious, speaking in broken fragments, but what she managed to say would unravel everything. What happened next would shock the entire town, and finally pull back the curtain on Cornelius Veneer's empire of nightmares. So don't go anywhere. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And trust me, you'll want to hear how this story ends. What would you do if a half-starved stranger showed up at your door, whispering that people were still chained underground, and that the world already believed them dead? That's exactly what happened one October night in 1891. Thomas Fairchild, editor of the Millerville Weekly Gazette, was working late when frantic knocking shattered the silence. He opened the door and froze. Standing there was a girl, maybe in her early 20s, though it was hard to tell. Malnutrition had thinned her frame, her clothes hung in tatters, and her bare feet left smears of blood on the wooden floor. But what struck Fairchild most was her eyes, wide, desperate, and filled with the kind of terror you don't forget. "They're still down there," she whispered, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "In the dark, they can't get out. The chains are too heavy." Fairchild ushered her inside, gave her water, and watched as she gulped it down like someone who hadn't had a drink in days. Slowly, between broken sentences, her story began to tumble out. Her name, or at least the name she clung to, was Sarah Henley. Maybe from Lancaster. She wasn't even sure anymore. What she was sure of, though, chilled Fairchild to the bone. She spoke of rooms beneath the opera house, small windowless cells where men and women were chained. She described the man with the needles and the bitter medicine who kept them weak. She recalled being forced to repeat the same movements again and again, until her body screamed with pain. And then she said something that made Fairchild's stomach turn. "They told me I was dead. They showed me the papers. My family thinks I'm gone." At first, Fairchild doubted her. The story was wild, too much like a nightmare. Maybe she was hysterical, maybe delusional. But the more she spoke, the harder it was to dismiss. Her description of the opera house basement matched architectural details Fairchild already knew. She named other captives, described their conditions, their appearances, even their real names. She mentioned details about Veneer's business operations no outsider could possibly know, and then came the biggest revelation of all. "There's a ledger," she told him, her voice firming with every word. "Mr. Veneer keeps it in his office. It has all our names, where we came from, how much we cost. He calls us his investments. Some entries go back years, Mr. Fairchild. Years." In that moment, Fairchild realized he wasn't just listening to a victim's tale of cruelty. He was staring straight into the heart of an organized criminal empire that had been operating under the town's nose for nearly a decade. And Sarah, broken, trembling but alive, was his key to exposing it. How had she managed to escape when no one else had? By mistake. Kellerman's assistant, a nervous young man named Peter, had miscalculated her nightly dose of laudanum. Instead of slipping into her usual drugged stupor, Sarah found herself unusually alert. When Peter fumbled with her shackles, failing to secure them properly, she seized her only chance. The opera house basement was a maze. Tiny rooms turned into cells, each one with a single prisoner chained to the wall. The restraints were locked with pulleys and bolts only Veneer and Kellerman had the keys to. Sarah's cell was wedged between two others, one belonging to Jan Brenner, the so-called Bavarian Colossus. Once a dock worker in Philadelphia, Jan's sheer size had made him perfect for the stage. But years of drugs and abuse had reduced the gentle immigrant to a childlike shadow of himself. On her other side was Catherine Ali, better known to audiences as Mary Catherine, the singing angel. Catherine had been born with a rare condition that left her arms underdeveloped, but her voice had been celebrated in her hometown of Scranton. She'd vanished after accepting an audition offer 3 years earlier, believing she was on the brink of stardom. The real horror wasn't just the chains or the locked doors. It was the way Veneer and Kellerman dismantled their prisoners' very identities. They gave them new names, told them their families thought they were dead, produced forged death certificates, often filed with the help of Sheriff Cromwell, who had contacts across several Pennsylvania counties. Sometimes they even showed forged letters, supposedly from family members, saying how relieved they were to no longer be burdened with them. Imagine hearing that day after day, year after year. For many captives, the psychological torture worked better than the drugs. They stopped fighting. They believed it. Fairchild didn't sleep for 3 days. Instead, he quietly investigated Sarah's claims. He dug into county records, combing through death certificates filed over the past 5 years. What he found was damning. An unusual number of people with disabilities or physical differences had been reported dead. Accidents, sudden illnesses, tragedies that raised little suspicion. But the dates and locations told a darker story. The deaths lined up almost perfectly with the circus's route through Pennsylvania towns. And the faces of the deceased? They looked hauntingly similar to the performers in Veneer's Cabinet of Wonders. Fairchild now had evidence, enough to blow the story wide open. But exposing the truth meant confronting dangerous men. Men with money, connections, and the power to crush anyone who threatened them. Still, he made his choice. On the morning of October 16th, Fairchild walked into the cramped basement office of Sheriff Josiah Cromwell. The air stank of tobacco and sweat. Cromwell sat at his desk, polishing his revolver, the metal gleaming in the lamplight. "Tom," he said without looking up, "you'd better be real careful about the questions you're asking. What happened next would nearly cost Fairchild his life." He went in with questions about suspicious death certificates, but walked out with blood dripping down his face and a revolver pointed at his skull. Cromwell didn't mince words. "Forget the girl. Forget what you saw. Accidents happen in mining towns. Chilling, right?" But in his arrogance, Cromwell slipped. His threats actually confirmed Sarah's story and revealed his own hand in the conspiracy. Fairchild was terrified, yes, but he was also a journalist. And now he had the biggest story of his life. He knew one thing for sure. Local law enforcement was useless. Worse than useless. If he went to state or federal officials, word would leak back to Cromwell before help arrived. So he came up with a desperate plan. Instead of waiting for justice to come to Millerville, he would bring the evidence out himself. Together with Sarah, the girl who had escaped, he began plotting an infiltration of the Opera House basement, the place of nightmares she had described. The goal wasn't to rescue, that would take an army, but to capture proof no one could deny. Photos of the prisoners, records of the crimes, evidence that could topple Veneer and his empire of cruelty. But they weren't as invisible as they thought. Dr. Kellerman, brilliant, paranoid, and dangerous, had started noticing things. Missing chloroform, photographic chemicals gone from his stores. Someone, he realized, was preparing to document their operation. Panic set in. He rushed to Veneer and Cromwell. The three men activated their emergency protocol. What was that? Simple, brutal, erase everything. Burn the records. Kill the captives. Leave nothing behind. Fairchild and Sarah had no idea they were walking straight into that trap. On the night of October 24th, 1891, under cover of darkness, they crept to the Opera House. Sarah swore the place would be empty. Veneer and his men usually spent nights drinking and gambling at the social club. It was the same routine that once gave her a chance to escape. Fairchild was counting on it to keep them safe. They slipped through a basement. Windows Sarah had left unlocked months earlier. The darkness inside was suffocating. The smell, unbearable. Human waste, sweat, and something else, a sweet, nauseating odor Fairchild couldn't place. With a tiny lantern, they moved through the maze of cells. And what Fairchild saw would scar him forever. The captives weren't just prisoners. They were broken shells of human beings, starved, chained, experimented on. Some barely conscious, lost in drug-induced stupors. Yon, once called the gentle giant, was now a skeleton in chains, his spirit shattered. When Sarah whispered his name, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, but nothing more. Catherine Ali, the voice of Millerville, had been reduced to a whispering shadow. Her once famous singing voice destroyed, her throat ruined from being forced to perform under Kellerman's drugs. Her eyes drifted like she was caught between worlds. Fairchild set up his camera, hands trembling, determined to capture proof. Meanwhile, Sarah moved quietly among the captives, whispering hope into their ears. And then, in a wine cellar-turned-laboratory, they found something even worse. Kellerman's tools. Bottles, syringes, surgical instruments. Evidence of medical experiments far darker than anything Sarah had described. It was no longer just criminal. It was something close to demonic. What happened next would change everything. What if I told you the truth wasn't written in the headlines, but hidden in a locked ledger, buried deep beneath an opera house? When Fairchild and Sarah broke into Veneer's office, they found exactly that. Behind a false panel, a book that held the darkest secrets of Millerville. And what was inside? Records of 43 people, stolen over 8 years, their real names, hometowns, even the lies that covered their disappearances. 17 were still alive, forced to perform under false identities. The rest, discontinued, a cold word that meant one thing: dead. But before Fairchild could take it all in, the trap snapped shut. Heavy boots pounded down the basement stairs. The air grew sweet and strange. Chloroform. It had been leaking through the vents the whole time. Sarah collapsed first. Fairchild, fighting to stay awake, grabbed his camera and tore a few ledger pages free. But his vision blurred, and the last thing he saw was Veneer himself, lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. Cromwell and Kellerman behind him. When he woke, he was no longer a journalist. He was a prisoner, shackled in the same chains he had seen on the others. His camera gone, the ledger gone, Sarah unconscious in the next cell. What followed was worse than death. Interrogations, Kellerman's surgical cruelty, Cromwell's brute violence, and Veneer's chilling calm. Veneer didn't just hurt him. He studied him. "You've got a presence, Thomas," he mused. "With the right training, you could be one of us." The scholar of sorrows, a tragic man of letters driven mad. Fairchild realized something terrifying. To Veneer, people weren't human. They were raw material, investments, acts for his cabinet of wonders. Or worse, because Veneer's empire wasn't just the circus. It stretched across 6 states, protected by corrupt officials and doctors. And the real money came from secret, private exhibitions for the wealthy. Intimate horrors, sometimes violent, sometimes sexual. And those clients paid more than any public show. Now the emergency protocol was in motion. Millerville's cabinet of wonders would be erased. The prisoners killed, the records burned, and every loose end silenced. Even townsfolk who had asked too many questions, even Peter, Kellerman's nervous assistant, Fairchild, and Sarah, they were already marked as discontinued. But here's where Veneer made his mistake. He thought Fairchild was alone, a reckless journalist chasing a story. What he didn't know was that Fairchild had been quietly sending letters to Margaret Dalton, one of the few women investigative reporters in the country, working at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Margaret had been reading every word. The question is, would those letters be enough to save them before the cabinet of wonders disappeared forever? Have you ever read a letter that felt less like correspondence and more like a warning? That's exactly what Thomas Fairchild's final letter was. Just 2 days before Sarah's daring escape, he wrote to Margaret Dalton. And this time, his tone had completely changed. Fairchild was no longer documenting curiosities. He was sounding the alarm. He warned her that Vandermeer's so-called Cabinet of Wonders was hiding something sinister, and told her flat out, "If you don't hear from me in 10 days, go to the federal authorities." That deadline was fast approaching. And Dalton? She wasn't the type to sit and wait. She'd already started reaching out to contacts in the Treasury Department and even the newly formed Bureau of Investigation. Just in case the worst happened, she also mailed copies of Fairchild's letters to newspapers in Pittsburgh and New York. It was her way of making sure the truth wouldn't be buried, even if she and Fairchild both disappeared. Then came October 28th, 1891, the day everything shifted. A telegram arrived at the Millerville telegraph office, addressed to Sheriff Cromwell, but written with hidden meaning. It was from Dalton herself. On the surface, it looked routine, an inquiry for a newspaper article. But in reality, it was a carefully coded warning to Fairchild. It read, "Sheriff Cromwell conducting research for article on traveling entertainments. Require interview with Thomas Fairchild and Cornelius Veneer. Federal authorities interested in regional business practices. Arriving November 1st with documentation team. Please arrange meetings. Muir Dalton, Philadelphia Inquirer." The operator, Henry Walsh, couldn't resist gossip. Instead of just handing it over to Cromwell, he mentioned it to half the town, including the barkeeper at the Millerville Social Club. By that evening, Veneer himself had heard about it, and that's when the panic set in. Federal investigators. A documentation team. The press already circling. His web of corrupt local officials couldn't protect him anymore. Desperate and terrified, Veneer made the worst decision of his life. He wouldn't flee. He wouldn't cover his tracks carefully. Instead, he triggered his emergency protocol. 17 captives would be poisoned. The opera house would be set ablaze to erase every trace. And Veneer? He'd vanish into the night with whatever cash he could grab. It was a reckless plan, and it would be the very thing that brought him down. October 29th began like the end of a nightmare. Dr. Kellerman, Venier's accomplice, prepared lethal doses of morphine and strychnine. The goal: kill the captives quickly, burn the bodies, and leave nothing behind. But then came an unexpected twist. Peter, Kellerman's young assistant, had finally reached his breaking point. For months, he'd been sick with guilt over what he'd seen, what he'd done. And the thought of watching 17 innocent people murdered, he couldn't bear it anymore. So he ran, straight to the home of Reverend Samuel Brooks, one of the only men in town who hadn't fallen under Venier's influence. At first, the Reverend thought Peter was raving, but then, the details, the names, the descriptions of people long thought dead, they were too precise to be lies. Together, they acted fast. Brooks fired off urgent telegrams to the Pennsylvania State Police and the governor's office. Meanwhile, Peter went back to the Opera House, determined to stall the killings. Kellerman had already started his work, administering sedatives that were in fact the first stage of poisoning. But Peter played his hand brilliantly. He claimed Sheriff Cromwell wanted one final interrogation of the captives, buying just enough time for help to get closer. And down in the damp, crumbling basement, Thomas Fairchild was making his own desperate move. He'd been beaten, half poisoned with chloroform and locked in iron restraints. But he'd noticed something his captors hadn't. The bolts holding him to the wall were lodged in rotting, water-damaged stone. With every ounce of strength left in him, he worked that anchor bolt loose. It was painful, slow, nearly impossible. But by sheer willpower, he freed himself. And here's where fate stepped in. At the very same time, Peter was delaying Kellerman upstairs, and Reverend Brooks's telegrams were reaching state officials. Fairchild finally slipped his restraints, but freedom didn't mean safety. Guards still roamed the Opera House. Poison had already entered the captive's veins. And Venier, in his frenzy, was preparing to set his final deadly plan into motion. Imagine breaking free from your chains, only to find that freedom was far more complicated than you thought. That's what Thomas Fairchild discovered when he slipped from his cell and began navigating the twisting, dim corridors of the Opera House. His earlier photographic tour of the building gave him a mental map, and that knowledge led him straight to the other captives. What he saw was heartbreaking. Some were drugged into near unconsciousness. Others had been so broken by years of fear and cruelty that they couldn't even believe rescue was possible. A few whispered that trying to escape would only bring worse punishments, and yet hope found its voice. Sarah, scarred but unshaken, stepped in. She'd escaped once before, and that gave her credibility. She knew each captive's fears, their strengths, their limits. One by one, she urged them to fight for this chance, convincing even those who barely clung to awareness. But the obstacles were brutal. Yon, the so-called gentle giant, was so starved and weak he could barely move. Catherine O'Malley's breathing was labored from a lung condition that had gone untreated. Others limped from injuries Kellerman had intentionally left to fester. Still, Fairchild and Sarah pushed forward, freeing as many as they could. While above them, chaos was building. Shouts, the scrape of furniture, heavy boots stomping overhead, signs that Venier's emergency plan was underway. Then came the turning point. Dr. Kellerman, growing uneasy with Peter's stalling, stormed into the basement. What he found shattered the illusion of control. Fairchild's empty restraints and prisoners slipping from their cells. His alarm echoed through the building, summoning Venier, Cromwell, and their hired muscle. The basement erupted into a deadly standoff. 17 weakened captives, 2 exhausted liberators, and a small army of armed men filled those narrow, choking corridors. Venier, revolver in hand, seemed poised to crush the rebellion, but arrogance can be fatal. Instead of carefully regaining control, Venier locked his rage onto Fairchild. To him, the journalist wasn't just an enemy. He was an insult that needed immediate punishment. That obsession gave Sarah and the stronger captives just enough of a window. They bolted toward the stairs, and waiting at the top was Peter, guiding them, warning them, shielding them from Venier's men. And then, a shock none of them expected. Cromwell, chasing Sarah and 2 others up the steps, ran straight into Reverend Brooks and 3 Pennsylvania State Police officers. Brooks hadn't planned a rescue. He'd come because he feared for Peter's life. The officers? They were an advance team, arriving earlier than anyone thought possible thanks to a lucky train connection. The moment Cromwell saw real lawmen inside the Opera House, his authority shattered. The officers already knew about the sheriff's corruption, and now, with frightened, half-starved captives stumbling into the light, the lies collapsed in front of him. Cornered, Vanier and Kellerman fled upstairs, barricading themselves in the office. Their goal was simple: burn the evidence and force a bloody escape. But there was one thing they didn't know. Fairchild had already photographed the incriminating ledgers during his first infiltration, and he and Sarah had hidden the copies where Vanier would never find them. The standoff dragged on for nearly 3 hours. Reinforcements arrived. More state police, even a representative from the Pennsylvania Attorney General. Meanwhile, the world outside Vanier's barricade was changing forever. 17 people, long written off as dead, were alive. Shaken, broken, but alive. They were photographed, interviewed, their testimonies recorded. It was undeniable proof of Vanier's horrors. And then, salvation came from the unlikeliest source. Johann, the massive, gentle man who had seemed lost to years of torment, suddenly locked eyes with Kellerman through a window in the barricade. Something inside him snapped back to life. With a roar of fury, Johann hurled himself at the blockade. Heavy desks and cabinets that would have stopped ordinary men splintered under his strength. Within minutes, the barricade crumbled. Kellerman collapsed in exhaustion and gave up without a fight. But Vanier, he wasn't finished. The officers burst in to find him calmly feeding ledger pages into a fire. Without looking up, he sneered, "Gentlemen, you're too late. Whatever crimes you think you can prove are ashes now." But he was wrong. Fairchild's photographs and the voices of the survivors were more powerful than any fire. Vanier's empire of cruelty was already finished. He just didn't realize it yet. What's the most haunting sound you can imagine in a place of such horror? Not screams, not gunfire, but a hymn. In the aftermath of the raid, Catherine Ali, her voice scarred but her will unbroken, began to sing, weak, trembling, but steady. One by one, the survivors joined her. Their voices, battered yet still alive, filled the Opera House with something that was both heartbreaking and defiantly human. By dawn on October 30th, 1891, the full scale of Cornelius Vanier's crimes was coming into focus. 17 survivors stood as living proof of his brutality, but the ledgers revealed a darker truth. 26 others, marked discontinued, would never have the chance to see justice. The trials that followed became national news. For the first time, America was forced to confront organized human trafficking head-on. Newspapers coast to coast covered every detail. Vanier himself was convicted on 43 counts of kidnapping, 17 counts of unlawful imprisonment, and 26 counts of murder. The evidence was crushing: survivor testimony, physical proof, and Fairchild's photographs. On March 15, 1893, he was executed. Crowds gathered, some protesting capital punishment, but very few wept for the man who had destroyed so many lives. Dr. Henrik Kellerman avoided the gallows, but not prison. His cooperation earned him life behind bars. His detailed confessions exposed accomplices across 6 states and peeled back the layers of a much larger network. His medical records also gave investigators a disturbing but crucial look at the physical and psychological damage inflicted on victims, knowledge that would shape future treatment. And recovery efforts, Sheriff? Cromwell's downfall was almost anticlimactic. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimonies of those he betrayed, he crumbled instantly. Hoping to save himself, he cut a deal, naming names and detailing corruption that reached deep into Pennsylvania's courts and politics. His sentence was cut to 20 years, but he served only 7 before dying of a heart attack in 1899. And what about the survivors? Their paths were as different as their scars. Sarah Henley rebuilt her life and became a fearless advocate for victims of trafficking, helping authorities crack down on similar rings. Johann Brenner, the gentle giant, never fully recovered his mind, but lived peacefully within his church community in Philadelphia until 1923, working with his hands and finding quiet purpose. Catherine O'Malley's voice never healed, but her spirit endured. She returned to her family in Scranton, eventually marrying a man who had waited for her through the years of her supposed death. She lived quietly until 1934. exchanging letters with other survivors until the end. As for the ones who exposed it all, Thomas Fairchild's reporting launched him into history as one of America's great investigative journalists. He never forgot the lesson of Millerville, the importance of giving voice to those who cannot speak for themselves. Margaret Dalton, whose coded telegram may have saved them all, became the Philadelphia Inquirer's first female investigative correspondent. She and Fairchild worked together on case after case, tearing the masks off other criminal networks throughout the 1890s. The Opera House itself, demolished in 1892. For decades, the site sat empty until 1934, when a small memorial garden was placed there, a plaque honoring the 17 who lived, and the 26 who didn't. But the true legacy of the Millerville case was bigger than one man, one town, or even one trial. It exposed just how vulnerable society's forgotten immigrants, orphans, people with disabilities really were. It forced changes in law enforcement, encouraging cooperation between local, state, and federal authorities. It led to reforms in how missing persons cases were investigated, and even the circus and traveling entertainment industry faced new regulations. Performers now had to prove their participation was voluntary, with regular inspections to prevent exploitation. Yet, as much as justice was served, disturbing questions lingered. Cromwell's testimony revealed Veneer wasn't a lone monster. He was part of a sprawling network. Some accomplices were caught. Others simply vanished, reappearing under new names in new towns. Even worse, investigators discovered some of the discontinued weren't murdered at all, but sold, passed like property into other operations. Most were never found. Their fates remain mysteries lost in the dark. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, Veneer thrived because society let him. Death certificates forged for the vulnerable. Officials paid to look away. Audiences hungry for entertainment that dehumanized the different. His crimes weren't born in shadows alone. They grew in the cracks of indifference and greed. In the end, the Millerville case stands as both a monument to resilience and a warning. 17 people declared dead had their names restored, their stories preserved. But how many others across America's past remain silent? How many voices were never heard? The monsters of history were never creatures of myth. They were human, flesh and blood, driven by profit, protected by corruption, and enabled by a society too willing to look the other way. So I'll ask you, do you think the whole truth was revealed? Or are there still shadows hiding what we'll never know? If this story gripped you, let us know in the comments. Do you believe everything came to light? Or do you think the darkness went deeper than the records ever showed? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Echoes of the Past for more chilling stories history tried to bury. Until next time, stay curious and beware the silence of forgotten voices.